Good evening, and welcome to the first Scowcroft event of the 2018-2019 school year. I'm Andrew Natsius, the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government. We are happy to have you participate in our conference in China this afternoon and hope you'll be able to join us for other events later in the semester, including our Pandemic Policy Summit on October 16th and a lecture by the 64th Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, on November 6th. This evening we will consider China's growing role in the world, its economy, and its future. China has been described as the greatest unresolved question of our era. I'll just give you one small anecdote from my own experience about Chinese foreign policy from the time that I was U.S. envoy to Sudan under President Bush 43, which might be instructive this evening. Between 2003 and 2006, about 300,000 people died in Darfur during terrible civil conflict there. Darfur is in the western part of Sudan. And terrible atrocities were committed by the Sudanese government. They burned down 3,800 villages, they raped 30,000 girls, and killed about 60,000 young men. The rest died from starvation and displacement. The United States and other countries, including China, were working to stop the bloodshed, and part of that involved getting the Sudanese government to accept a UN African Union peacekeeping troops. President Bashir of Sudan said publicly and told me privately he would never allow one single UN blue-helmeted peacekeeping soldier into Darfur. I told this to President Bush, and I said, we need a little help here. He called President Hu Jintao of China. China had heavy investments in the oil sector in Sudan, and asked for help to reverse President Bashir's decision, which was quite militant. Bashir was repeatedly making this statement. President Bush called Hu Jintao and said, we need you to intervene. And he said, as a friend, as a colleague in the international system, we need to resolve this. Would you please, as a personal favor to me, intervene? And he did. He called President Bush quietly. They didn't make it public. In fact, I'm not sure to this day it's been in the news media. And it was a veiled threat. And 2 weeks later, publicly, Bashir announced, for humanitarian reasons, we have decided to allow peacekeeping troops from the United Nations to patrol Darfur. And 24,000 AU troops eventually came, the largest contingent in UN history. So China did play, in my experience, a constructive role in resolving the Darfur peacekeeping crisis. Now, it didn't end the civil war there, but the civil war is still going on, unfortunately. Tonight, our panel includes three distinguished scholars who have written many books and articles on China. Dr. Elizabeth Economy, who is the Director of Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. David Lampton, who is the Director of China Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And Dr. Carl Minzner, who is Professor of Law at Fordham University. And lastly, our own Will Norris at the Bush School will formally introduce our speakers in the panel tonight and serve as the moderator of the discussion following their talks. Professor Norris is a China policy professor here and directs the Bush School's China Studies program. He's also written a recent book about China's strategic use of economic statecraft. Please join me all in welcoming our speakers this evening. Will?
So I'm actually going to begin it from a seated position here, not out of disrespect, but out of a note of casualness. For those of you who know me, I'm not a very formal person. I don't get hung up on formal protocols. But I will go ahead and just very quickly kick off our panel today. I wanted to design a little bit of a conversation among three very well-informed scholars on China, particularly in this moment in China's history and what this means for China and what it means for the world. And I don't want to detract from that. They're all very good at what they do. Trust me when I say that. You're welcome to look them up online. A lot of them are available online now. And we're just going to go ahead and get started. I've asked them to start with a brief set of opening remarks, and then we're going to go and have a little bit of a conversation among us. And I thought you all might be interested in listening to that conversation. And so we'll let them decide if you want to use the podium, you're welcome to use it. If you want to do it from your chair, you're welcome to do it from the chair. We're going to start with Carl, and then we'll go to Liz, and then we'll wrap up with Mike, and then we'll have some questions. And then at the very end, we'll have an opportunity to get some questions from the audience. So,
since I'm not nearly as comfortable as my august panelists, I think I'm actually going to speak from the podium.
Sure, yeah,
Please forgive me.
no
I know
problem.
It's a little more formal, but it helps me keep my train of thought. Thanks to Will and thanks to my other panelists for the honor to be here. It's a first time ever in College Station, so thank you very much. I'm mostly a domestic politics person, so I'll focus particularly on what's taking place domestically in China, and then I think my co-panelists may be able to offer more comments on the foreign policy side. The late 1970s saw Beijing's rulers steer China out of the political chaos and the economic stagnation that had characterized China's Maoist era. And they launched the policies of 改革开放, the policies of reform and opening up. In the following decades, domestic Chinese politics were marked by three key characteristics: rapid economic growth, a certain degree of ideological openness to the outside, and relative political stability marked by partially institutionalized political norms, such as the retirement and succession of top party leaders. That era, in all three areas, is ending. China is economically it's slowing, ideologically it's closing up, and politically those partially institutionalized norms are coming undone. Economically, China is facing the end of its go-go era, boom years. The period of 10%, 10% GDP growth year after year is fading into the past. The key unanswered questions for China going forward are whether or not it's going to follow a trajectory such as South Korea and Taiwan and gradually transition to a much lower rate of growth, whether it's going to encounter a period like Japan of prolonged close to zero growth, or whether perhaps like what's happening to Turkey right now, you start to see a more dramatic implosion of debt and property bubbles that lead to a more significant hard landing. Ideologically, China is tightening across the board. The post-1978 reform era had seen Beijing turn the dial down on the ideological fires that had burned so bright under the Maoist era. So Beijing pivoted away from Maoist isolation and Maoist insularity. Foreign practices and overseas experience during the reform era were no longer automatically suspect. Instead, they were crucial tools for developing China. Party authorities also turned down the ideological flames that had characterized sort of domestic politics. So they backed out of citizens' personal lives. They granted individuals and firms the autonomy to make economic decisions on their own, and they reopened churches and mosques that had been shuttered during the Cultural Revolution. And they also created a degree of space, albeit limited, for contested discussion and dissent regarding state policies, both within the party itself and within society at large. All of these things have also started to reverse. Within the party, suspicion is mounting across the board directed at foreign influences, whether it is Chinese students returning from overseas to take positions within the Chinese government, whether it is international civil society organizations operating in China, or whether it is U.S. corporations doing business there. Simultaneously, the controls have been ramped up again against a much stronger, much wider range of organizations within China. This time, it's not just the narrow edge of political dissidents who, even under the reform era, had suffered significant pressure. Rather, it's a much greater range of institutions that are starting to come under the microscope. So organizations that had enjoyed a degree of space in the reform era are finding that space being yanked away. So academic institutions are finding that their ability to hold international conferences reduced, and finding that they're having more increased scrutiny of their ties with overseas. Domestic religious groups regarded as foreign, particularly Muslim or Chinese Christian ones, are being subjected to significantly tighter restrictions. And politically, the third element, the partially institutionalized norms that had characterized the reform era are beginning to come undone one after another. Norms such as collective leadership, norms such as more regularized retirement and succession of top leaders, norms such as the aversion to anything resembling a cult of personality, all of these things had been established, been sort of built up by Deng Xiaoping and a generation of leaders who themselves had suffered through the Cultural Revolution and were looking for a way to steer China in a different direction. However, all of those have started to go one after another. All of them have been broken or significantly eroded within the past 5 years. I can go into more examples, and I can talk more about the how and why in the Q&A if people are interested. But the takeaway is that China is sliding back in the direction of a more highly personalized authoritarian state. Now, some observers have argued that this means Xi is a new Mao. I don't go that far. There are still several key reform-era norms that have not yet been broken. And the key one of the big ones, is bottom-up social mobilization. There's been no sense that Xi, if you go back to the Maoist era, Mao was calling people, students, out into the streets to attack his enemies of the day. There's been no sign in China that Xi wants to open that last seal. Instead, what's taking place is very much a top-down strategy. But the key point is that the reform era itself is unwinding. And once you conclude that the political rules of the game that have governed China for the past 3 or 4 decades are coming undone, the operative question starts to be, what's the next one to go? And just to be clear, while the story that I'm telling in the political sphere of political erosion inside China's one-party Leninist system, that's the story I'm telling. I'm actually not bashing China. The idea that political norms are breaking down has parallels even in democratic societies. Look at Turkey, look at India, look at the Philippines, or look at the United States. If I was a US expert, I might try to tell a story where the last 2 decades of the 20th century saw a fusion of money and party politics that led to a steady erosion of American political institutions by the early 21st century. Existing norms began to give way. Bipartisan compromise, actually having a federal budget on a regular basis. Senate rules regarding the use of the filibuster. Ideology started to close down. There was a turn against immigration and free trade. There was a slide towards alternative mechanisms of governance, direct communication over Twitter, the use of vaguely defined leadership groups, the cult of personality over experience, the purge of the heads of both the domestic security services and the diplomatic corps. I had to throw that one in because Texas, and so that's, you guys, you know, the head of State Department. Naturally, there are crucial differences. What's taking place in China is a top-down one led by Xi Jinping and fellows around him, rather than a bottom-up one. What's taking place in the States, bottom-up populist movements that are shaking our system. But make no mistake, the risks of what are taking place in China are just as severe, if not more so, than in the United States. Because if you, like me, are worried about the trends you see here in the US, I think you have to ask what happens when you see core political erosion in a country like China, where the entire institutional political architecture is of much more recent vintage, not 200 or 300 years, but it goes just back to the late 70s or early 80s. That's the partially institutionalized norms that we're talking about that are going under. And when you think back to the history, a much more recent history of intense political violence, Cultural Revolution, Maoist purges and the like, and particularly when you start to see not just these political shifts, but also the economic and ideological shifts that are going on. And that's why I think what's happening right now is so worrying, so risky, because I think once you start pulling these things apart, these core political norms apart, the underlying problems that characterized China in the pre-reform era start pushing themselves zombie-like back to the surface. So local officials competing to exalt the top leader, breakdown in channels of information to the top as people become increasingly unwilling to reflect back negative information. Efforts to spread party influence back into areas from which it had retreated in the 1980s. Look what's happening in academia, culture, and corporate firms with the reactivization of party cells. More vicious internal score settling within the party as sort of the struggle for power becomes vicious. And a steady repoliticization of society. Look at some of the developments out in Xinjiang. All of that spells trouble. In the short term, I think it bodes for a much more hardline, personalized authoritarian state. But in the longer term, what I worry is that I think it's a recipe for the revival of internal political instability that observers had thought was dead and buried with the beginning of the reform era. So I'll stop with that, and I'm sorry I had to speak from the podium.
No, that was great. Thanks. Thank you very much, Carl. Liz.
Since anyway I left my notes in the other room, so there's really no point for me to go to the podium at this point. So my remarks are going to, well, let me say thank you first to Will and to Dr. Natsios for inviting me here, and it really is a pleasure to be on the stage with Carl and Mike, two super distinguished scholars of China. So Will asked me to talk a little bit about Xi Jinping's impact on China, and I think you'll find that my remarks are going to build a lot on what Carl has just said. I think in order to understand Xi Jinping's impact, I'm going to take you back not too far, just to October of 2017, to the 19th Party Congress, when Xi Jinping was reselected as General Secretary of the Communist Party for his second 5-year term. Right? He was first appointed or selected in 2012 and reselected in 2017. And somewhere in the midst of his 3.5-hour speech at the Party Congress, he uttered the statement, "China has stood up, grown rich, become strong, and is moving towards center stage." And I think if you parse that statement, you get a pretty good sense for the periods of political economic development that Carl discussed just a few minutes ago. You know, the first China stood up was really Mao Zedong, right? Mao Zedong standing up against the Japanese invaders, standing up against the Kuomintang, and creating the contemporary Chinese Communist Party state. The second period of development was Deng Xiaoping, some almost 30 years later, late 1970s, early 1980s, the period of reform and opening up. Right? As Carl said, during this period, China began to welcome foreign influence. It introduced the market into the Chinese economy. You had the beginnings of civil society, the establishment of the first non-governmental organizations. And yes, China welcomed both foreign capital and foreign ideas. Critically, Deng Xiaoping also believed in keeping a low profile in terms of foreign policy in order to focus on developments domestically. He wanted to grow the economy and to improve the lives of the Chinese citizens. And now you have the third period, and that's China has become strong and is moving towards center stage. And that, I would argue, is Xi Jinping, that becoming strong and moving towards center stage. So what does that look like in practical terms? So let me just put out 4 broad trends that I see emerging that in some respects I think reverse, really, that period of Deng Xiaoping, that period of reform and opening up, almost 180 degrees. So first, as Carl mentioned, you had a system of collective leadership under Deng Xiaoping. Under Xi Jinping, you're moving from having a collective leadership to a far more authoritarian, single-man system of rule, right? So Xi Jinping sits on top of all of the most important committees and commissions that oversee broad areas of government policy, whether you're talking about national security or economic reform or cybersecurity, right? He sits on top of all of them. He's used his anti-corruption campaign, which I believe is a legitimate campaign to root out corruption. I mean, he said from the very beginning that corruption, if not addressed, could be the death of the Chinese Communist Party and even the death of the Chinese state. And actually, if you look back at Xi Jinping as he rose through the party ranks, the issue that he talked about most clearly was corruption, right? That he did not believe that party officials should use their positions for personal economic gain. So this is something that I believe he actually feels very strongly. Nonetheless, he has used the anti-corruption campaign to target his political opponents and competitors, right, to remove them. And he's also, I think, as Carl alluded to, he amended the Constitution, right? The party amended the Constitution to eliminate the 2-term limit for the president. And this is something that a lot of Chinese were very proud of. It was an element of a contemporary, modern system of governance, right? So what this means now is that Xi Jinping can remain as General Secretary, Chairman of the Central Military Commission, and President of the country, well, in perpetuity, but not really, for as long as he and the rest of the Chinese leadership decide that he can stay. So the one thing we've seen is this move from the collective to the single authoritarian leader. The second is, again, as Carl, I think, alluded to, the reassertion of the Communist Party into everyday economic and political life. Right? Deng Xiaoping was about withdrawing the party in many respects, right? Opening up the system to the market, both the marketplace of ideas and civil society and the market in terms of the economy. Xi Jinping has very much reintroduced the party. So he's reintroduced it, I would say, in ways, the surveillance system, right? 176 million cameras, that they want to get to 626 million cameras, with facial recognition and AI to do surveillance, a system of social credit, right, a system of trustworthiness, measuring people's trustworthiness based on a series of metrics yet to be completely determined, but could include anything from whether you've repaid a debt to whether you've jaywalked to whether you watch too many hours of video games. Trying to understand who's trustworthy, who's not, and then either rewarding or punishing people on the basis of this kind of score. Certainly clamping down on the internet and the free flow of information within China. Recently, you might have seen that 2 women were arrested for a discussion they were having in a private WeChat, right? Just in a private email exchange, were arrested for talking about the likelihood that disease could be spread when they were experiencing these huge floods in the northern part of the country. So an enormous amount of intrusion, really, into the daily life of the Chinese people, the kind of thing that we haven't seen, I'd say, since the Maoist period. And also in terms of enterprises, re-energizing party committees and establishing party committees in enterprises, not only state-owned enterprises, but private enterprises and even joint ventures, right? And, party committees were made up of party members. What would they used to do? They'd read, a speech that Xi Jinping might give and talk about it, or they would be responsible for some good social works, a tree planting campaign. But Xi Jinping has determined that he wants these party committees to be far more actively involved in the actual decision-making of the firms. So, telling a joint venture, that they want the joint venture to invest in a certain place, saying they want the party chair of the committee to be the chairperson of the board of the company. So really revolutionary in many respects, and I will say, from having spoken to some members of joint ventures and private enterprises and Chinese private enterprises, makes them very unhappy. Right? Chinese entrepreneurs are very unhappy with this turn of events. They don't want to be told where they should invest. Alibaba does not want to have to take a stake in China Unicom or China Tower, failing state-owned enterprises. So this kind of thing, again, is fairly radically different from what was happening before. The third significant change is that Xi Jinping has moved to try to control much more closely what information, ideas, and capital come into the country. So while I would say he's much more ambitious in terms of going out, more controlling in terms of what's coming in. Again, I think you can see this in efforts to control virtual private networks, right? Trying to limit the ability of the Chinese people to go around the Great Firewall and access information from outside the country. But you also see it in terms of things like the law and the management of foreign NGOs. Carl was mentioning, civil society, NGOs. One of the really important, influential aspects of the development of civil society in China has been the interaction between foreign NGOs and those that are homegrown within China. At one point, foreign environmental NGOs and foundations were responsible for about 90% of the funding of domestic Chinese environmental NGOs. An enormous amount of training of Chinese civil society activists. So prior to the implementation of the law in January of 2017, there were upwards of 7,000 foreign NGOs that were active in China. Today, I think the number is about 400 or so. So after the passage of the law, which put many more constraints on foreign NGOs, requiring them to register with the Ministry of Public Security and undertake a number of other onerous kind of compliance mechanisms, make it very difficult for NGOs, foreign NGOs, to register in China. And I would say that Made in China 2025, which you've probably heard of, it's the Chinese sort of industrial development program to try to ensure that by 2025, depending on the area, between 40 and 80% of the production of 10 areas of critical cutting-edge technologies. So, it could be AI, it could be robotics, new materials, next-generation information technology. So 10 of these areas, medical devices, that Chinese companies dominate the home market and, in fact, become global champions. So I consider that to be creating an unfair playing field for multinationals within China. And you can already see it happening. In Sichuan province, for example, the local government has told the hospitals that for 15 medical devices, everything from stents to respirators to imaging machines, they must purchase Chinese-made products. Right? So this is another sort of new endeavor by the Xi government. And then just to finish up, because I don't want to go too far over my time, On the foreign policy front, here too, I think you see a very significant shift from the Deng era of keeping a low profile to a far more ambitious and expansive foreign policy under Xi Jinping. And I'll just tick off 3 areas. I know that Mike's going to talk about foreign policy more in depth, but I'll just point to 3. First, moving from what I would call staking claims of sovereignty to realizing them. So in areas like the South China Sea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, setting out a soft target of 2049 for the reunification of China, actually making moves to see that will happen. So, you know, there have always been little, you know, fracases in the South China Sea, you know, a Philippine fishing boat and a Vietnamese fishing boat and a Chinese fishing boat, you know, having a little, you know, interaction of some sort. But obviously Xi Jinping, you know, they have dredged up and created basically 7 artificial features and have militarized them quite significantly. That represents a very dramatic shift from what was before. Second pretty significant shift, I would say, is the Belt and Road Initiative. And there's been a lot about this in the press, but this is just basically Xi Jinping's effort to, you know, recreate in some ways the Silk Road and the maritime spice routes, but really bring the centrality of China back to the fore in the global system, both in terms of linking China to many countries, up to 80 now, but I think really the whole world at this point, through hard infrastructure like ports and railroads, but also through digital, wants to capture, you know, the satellite systems and e-commerce and fiber optic cables, also the spread of a China model politically, which we can discuss. There's a lot of debate in the China scholarly community about whether or not China is actually trying to export parts of its political model. I believe it is, but again, this is a source of debate. So the Belt and Road Initiative. The last thing I'll say is I think there's a pretty significant effort underway under the Xi government to begin to change norms in global governance, right? To bring Chinese values, Chinese beliefs, Chinese policy priorities into international institutions. And you may say, well, why shouldn't it be, right? China is the 2nd largest economy in the world, 2nd largest military, largest population. Of course, it should exert a profound influence in establishing the, you know, sort of rules by which the international system is governed. And I don't disagree with that, but I think it's important that we understand the kind of impact that China is going to have in areas like internet sovereignty and human rights or development finance even, because I think in many respects it runs counter to what you know, has been the sort of traditional model of liberal democratic governance, and in that respect poses a pretty significant challenge to traditional models. So all told, I would say I think I agree completely with Carl in the sense that what Xi Jinping has created is a China that is both more authoritarian and more controlling at home, but also more ambitious and expansive on the international front.
Thank you, Liz. Great, terrific. Mike, they've set a high bar because they've all come in exactly at 10 minutes. This is very impressive. For most academics, this is an unheard of feat to be able to come in at what the moderator says. Oh, prepare about 10 minutes worth of commentary. Very unprecedented. So please.
So I'm looking at 6:33.
Yeah.
So I have till 6:43.
Yep.
Okay. So we all have a measure here. First of all, I'll just stipulate it's great to be back in Texas. I actually, in 1968, lived in San Antonio and worked at Brooke Army Medical Center during the war in Vietnam. But we had a great time as a young married couple here in Texas. So just to say that, I want to thank the Scowcroft Institute and the Bush Library. And I want to acknowledge the role that actually both Presidents Bush and General Scowcroft made to the era that we've noted. Really, I think many of us are sad to say, has passed. The reform era isn't what it was, and the foreign policy stance of China has changed dramatically. And I wish I hadn't reached that conclusion, but I have. And so take that. But I was struck by Director Nacio's recounting of the Sudan. And there was a time where we cooperated in the world for important things. And on 9/11, which today, in 2001, President Bush's ambassador at the time, Sandy Rand, came to SAIS, where I have taught for many years. And there had been a little debate during the campaign that President George W. Bush was victorious in. And the issue was, is China a competitor or a rival, or can we cooperate? And after 9/11, Sandy Rand, former roommate, I believe, of George W. Bush's, said, we've seen the enemy, and it's not China. So the world we're talking about tonight is a very different world than the people that founded these institutions here in Texas. And we ought to be, as we realize in a sort of a realistic way how much has changed, we should have an aspiration to try to produce cooperation where we can. Now, I think those opportunities are not as great by any means that I would like. How much has changed? I was struck. I bought a bunch of newspapers, got to the red carpet room at the National Airport, and had 2 hours to read the newspapers. And of course, I noticed 9/11. But then I read the Washington Post, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. And except on all of the editorial pages, there was nothing about 9/11, not a whole lot on terrorism, although a little on Afghanistan. But there were at least 8 different lines of story about China. And let me just tick them off, because this morning's papers, taken as an aggregate, tell you how much has changed. First of all, Article 1, U.S. in danger of becoming number 2 in the world. And that was worth about a half a page. Number 2, Google caves into China on search engine. Whole freedom of information and all of that. Number 3, China engaged, and this was about 3/4 of a page, in military exercises with the Russians. With the Russians, biggest exercise in years, and the Chinese are involved in it to a substantial degree. Number 4, huge articles in several of the papers on Uyghurs, Muslims in Xinjiang, detention, and various infractions of human rights within those institutions. The next one, U.S. and China in a life and death economic race to who's going to dominate the 5G world. Next thing, it was almost 3/4 of a page on the forest city in Malaysia that is a huge Chinese development effort with, I think, going to have up to something like 700,000 people in it. I've been doing research in Malaysia, so they're all talking about this. But the whole idea is really sort of a neo-colonialism, China reaching out and dominating its periphery economically and culturally. Another whole line of attack was the North Korean nuclear program, and that China, because of its bilateral problems with us in trade and otherwise, is not cooperating once again to our analysis on that problem. And you haven't even heard tonight, trade war. Trade war, right? That's on every business page in every paper, including the one I read in the Houston airport while I was sitting there. In fact, that was the biggest article in the local state paper here. And you haven't even heard what I think is the biggest time bomb in the whole thing, and that's Taiwan. And we could talk about that, but the papers didn't happen to mention it, at least that I saw today. Let me get this back on.
This is so exciting.
So, long and the short of it, can people hear?
It's the wrong way.
Well, let me just hold it and make it right. So, in any case, the world has really changed. When President Clinton came into office, he talked about, with Jiang Zemin, building with China a partnership in the 21st century. That vocabulary is inconceivable in the political environment, both in China and in the United States at the current time. And if you want to just sort of find the documentation that makes it clear how much has changed, Look at the national security strategy of December last year and the national defense strategy of this year. It's polite, not even politely put in those documents, but we've moved from talking about partnership in the early 90s to, in fact, talking about rivals, competition, and grave threats not only to our values but our security. So what I'm really trying to say is the institution you're at played a very big role in creating a quite different relationship. Now, of course, it takes two to tango, and the Chinese needed to be part of that, and a major change you've heard, and I don't disagree with anything that's been said. Now, let me just make 3 points, because I only have 3 minutes left. So we'll get 1 point in per minute here. First of all, the current trade war, and I think you can, without exaggeration now, call it a trade war, is not ending anytime soon. And it's not going to end anytime soon for a very simple reason. Both sides, meaning the two respective administrations, both think they're in an advantageous position and time is working in their favor. I think that's profoundly misguided on both sides, because I think it's going to be lose-lose in a very big way for everybody. Now, it will end at some point, but it's not going to end at any time soon. In the Q&A, we can talk about, if you wish, why I would think that. Secondly, if you ask, ultimately, what is the U.S. objective in both the trade war and our general policy, I think China has been tremendously successful in its own terms, as it thinks about it, in using state industrial policy to develop new competitive global industries. And you see this, I'm writing a book on high-speed rail construction projects in Asia. But China in 2002 had no high-speed rail industry, and it is now almost, it's fair to say, a global gold standard on that. It now has built out a huge domestic system, 4 trunk lines, north-south, 4 east-west, and it's hooking those into its periphery around China. You could say the same thing on civil nuclear power industry that China built pretty much with the ground up. A lot of foreign help, but China's indigenized, improved it, and is now exporting these technologies. High-speed rail for China is going to be, for China, it hopes, what Boeing aircraft really was, driving American industry and supply chains. And China has done this by focusing Manhattan-style project kind of resources, research and development, legitimate and illegitimate technology application, and anybody who understates the success, really, of this process doesn't understand the challenge that the United States and other advanced modern industrial societies face. And President Trump, I think unrealistically, frankly, is trying to get China to undo that policy. And unless I radically misunderstand China, they're not going to do it. Now, they'll operate around the fringes and make concessions here and there, but they're not undoing that policy, I'm pretty sure. So that's one reason I think this is. The third thing is, I think Liz mentioned, and I'll wind up with it. I think it's not just about our interests, and it's not just about our power, but it's really about our values. And it was driven home to me when I took a train from Guizhou, a southern, southwestern, rural, poor province, to Guangzhou, and then got on a car to drive to Hong Kong. And I was starting out on with the driver on the highway, and there were all these detection devices. And I said to the driver, "My God, you guys really care about speeders around here." Well, he said, "Oh, no, Professor Lampton, you don't understand. Those are all image devices. They know everybody who's in this car. They know everything about this car. And when you get to the border, you're either going through with hardly tapping the brakes, or you're not going through." And it was also drawn home when I went to the headquarters of Mobike. I see out here you've got OFO, right? Well, there's Mobike also in Beijing. Went to the headquarters of Mobike, and they merged the GPS system, the payment system, the big data, recognition, and they have real time. They can track every little dot that represents a bicyclist, where they're going, and retrieve all the data relevant to the person and presumably the address to where they're going. So that was just, so what we are really seeing is the utilization of big data, recognition, payment systems as an item of social control. And whatever you want to say about Americans, they're not big on social control, right? So I think this is going to be a very big issue between us. So I think it's very important to the world that we find a way to try to deal with this as constructively as we can, but it isn't going to be easy. And I guess I can say at my age, this is the problem we're leaving all of you and you Bush School students that are going to be managing this. This is the job. Thank you.
Thank you, really, to all three of the panelists. I think they've given us great opening remarks, good fodder for our discussion. And before we begin the next phase of your venue for this evening, I wanted to commend each of them. If you're interested in these topics, these are critically important topics, I think, for today's world. They each have produced wonderful books on the topics that they're talking about. I would encourage you to go track them down and read a book. I know it sounds crazy. This is what I tell my students. Like, this is something that's a little bit old-fashioned, but if you really want to know something about something, more than just a blog post or a quick little tweet, you could actually go and read detailed scholarly books that each of these people has produced recently on these topics. And so I'd encourage you to drink deeply from that well of knowledge. I wanted to react to a couple of things that I heard from the panelists. We'll start with something, Mike, you led off with about the importance, and given our setting here at the Bush School and the Scowcroft Institute, and the picture that you paint, relatively pessimistic picture, I think, that all three of you sort of leave the impression that we're at right now in US-China relations, but also, importantly, in China's own relations to the world. Can you envision another Bush-Scowcroft moment in China's relationship to the world, and what would that take? What would it look like? From where we are here today, first, is it even possible to get back to that kind of a world? Because keep in mind, this is the team that got us through Tiananmen in the US-China relationship and China's relations with the whole outside world. No small feat in terms of diplomacy and the general trajectory of China. Were we to go back to that moment of diplomacy, of the diplomatic finesse in a China's foreign policy and a Chinese relationship between the United States and China specifically, but more broadly between China and the world, what would that have to look like? Is even possible? And the answer is impossible. That's an easy answer. But I think it's more creative and maybe more provocative to think, what would that look like were that to happen?
Well, first of all, if you put it just in the simplest form, is it possible to go back to those days? I suppose the simple answer is no. Right. But it is possible to go to a better day, right? Mm-hmm. Yep. So that's sort of how I'd frame it. And then you say, well, what has to happen to get towards a better day? First of all, it's been interesting. A lot of public opinion polls that take attitudes towards China by age group. Mm-hmm. Almost every poll shows, I just don't fully understand it, but the younger people are much more optimistic about the capacity to deal with China than older people who have gone through all this. So go figure, right? But so I guess I didn't end by accident saying, this is your job, you students in this audience, right? You've got to get to a better day because it's catastrophic, the consequences of whether it's cooperating on global warming or global health issues or urbanization, transportation, fisheries in the world, right? So just the distribution of opinion in our society gives me a little hope. Now, in one of the books that I did, I had a chapter called People Count. I don't have a total leadership-driven idea that leaders can change everything, but I think we're living through the times where we can see leaders really do matter here and in China. And much of what my colleagues said really boiled down to what Xi Jinping has done, and we don't have to have a lot of commentary on here. So I think that leaders count. And without putting too fine a point on it, we're going to have to get different leaders. Now, you can talk about how that's going to happen. But I think right now, with the constellation of leaders we have, it's kind of hard to see.
No, I actually agree exactly. I think given Xi Jinping's ambition in terms of, I think, overall pushing the United States out of Asia as the dominant regional hegemon, in terms of his idea of a community of shared destiny, which is basically marks the end of the U.S.-led alliance system. Basically says that U.S. alliances are anachronistic and we don't need them anymore. I think the idea that you're going to be exporting elements of authoritarianism. China is now in a number of African countries, Southeast Asia, Latin America, training officials on how to manage the media, right? On the surveillance system. They want to export that surveillance system. I think given all of that, given the difference in values, given the desire of Xi Jinping to have China play such a larger role on the global stage in ways that are, in many respects, antithetical to U.S. interests and values, I think you do need different leaders. And then we have our own leader, as Mike said, right? And I think, interestingly, President Trump, really his focus has been primarily on two issues, on the trade issue and on North Korea. I mean, when he came into power, that's really all he cared about. President Trump does not, as far near as I can tell, care very much about what's happening in Xinjiang, right? He's not about human rights, for example. He's not about many of these other issues. He really had these two issues. It was really a sort of, but that vacuum that he left really allowed many other members of, I'd say, Congress, right, some of them do care about human rights, who are much more concerned about our alliance structures, for example. I mean, at one level, President Trump was Xi Jinping's dream, right? Because President Trump's like, what do we need these alliances for? We pay too much money. I can cancel out Japan and South Korea unless you pay more, right? What do we need NATO for? I mean, that gave Xi Jinping an enormous opening, but, not to be had. And so you had, Secretaries Mattis, Tillerson, and now Pompeo. You have Congress. They're not going to let that happen. So I think we've got many streams feeding into our China policy now. If it were just President Trump, with the exception of the whole focus on the bilateral trade deficit, I think he would, in some respects, probably make it not that difficult for China.
Go to the next slide.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious. So, Carl, you had talked about in your talk about how these norms, these institutions that we had fragilely begun to assume about China are now being eroded and very deliberately and dramatically and across a number of different areas. But I wanted to think a little bit about maybe a little longer time horizon beyond 78. To go back further in China, was you had a chance to sit in on the domestic politics class today. My question to the group to kind of talk about is, how really different is Xi Jinping in the sense of China, in modern China, as we know the modern instantiation of the Chinese project, building a modern nation state at the end of the Qing dynasty? Has his preferred outcomes and preferred policy line, how out there was this from what was in fact mainstream, normal, everyday? This is the game plan. So the provocative hypothesis is, how far off base was Xi Jinping as opposed to, why is everybody surprised here? This was, who thought, crazy American academics, that we were going to go in this direction? Scowcroft, Bush, that was you guys projecting what you wanted to see China become, not who we are and where we want to be headed as a nation. So the provocative question is, how much of this surprise shift under Xi Jinping that we're talking about today is because of the blinders that we as an analytic community put on our American understanding of China and its development, as opposed to something that's really de novo, organically from within China?
I'll push back a little bit on that. On a version, there's another version of that kind of question that I've heard before, which essentially goes to, phrased slightly differently. It's, China has never changed since 1949, at least in sort of core political stuff. That anything that you saw, whether it was civil society, whether it was local elections, all that was just a facade for making China look a particular way. I will push back against that, because I think it overlooks the point that during the reform era, there was a fundamental contest within people inside the party bureaucracy and within society as to what the shape of the system should look like. Certainly after 1989, any hope for sort of serious, deep democratic reform was off the table. But even after 1989, party authorities themselves, people at the very top, Politburo Standing Committee, these are folks who themselves had lived through the Cultural Revolution. They were grappling with the question of what happens when power is too highly concentrated at the hands of somebody at the top of the system? What happens when power is too highly concentrated at the hands of the party secretary in a particular county, in a particular village? We've got to find some sort of channels to address those core basic principles of supervision of power, not because we want democracy, but because we don't want the local party secretary in some committee robbing the public purse blind or abusing the rights of the citizens such that they end up burning down the county party headquarters. That was kind of the rubric that was going on in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, and it meant that people within the system themselves were open to some of the civil society issues that Liz has looked into. They were open to sort of experimenting with certain types of local electoral mechanisms. They weren't going to go immediately in the direction of democracy, but they were experiments that were going on. What happened, unfortunately, at each of those experiments is a rolling stone gathers moss. So you end up having people start to use them. They start to create the system for public interest lawyers to begin to challenge administrative legal reforms, to challenge local government. People start using them not just against locals, they go up a little bit higher. At each of those points, party authorities say, that's gone too far, we're going to pull back. And so the system has systematically undermined these little sprouts, these potential for evolution in a particular direction. And that's the really sad thing, is that there were opportunities and those paths have been closed. And when those paths get closed, what's left? Go back to the 50s and 60s. And that's why it's what you're seeing. But it's not like this was predestined. It's an unfortunate tragedy of the Chinese political system itself that it's going in this direction.
Yeah.
So one of the fun things when I was doing the research for my most recent book, and Carl, actually, we had books come out with the same publisher within a few months of each other, so it's really fun to be on the stage with him right now. I think it's the first time we've done something together, right? So, but one of the fun things was I looked in each of my chapters back through history to try to understand whether or not this was truly new. And it was great because you can see that what Xi Jinping is doing now, from censorship to corruption to the sort of the bolder foreign policy, all of those strands are strands that we've seen at various points through imperial China. Nothing is actually all that new. I mean, obviously the technology is new, but in terms of the overall orientation, both at home and looking, out, you can see the strands of Xi Jinping today there, right? So corruption was a problem dating back centuries. Issues of censorship dating back centuries. It's fascinating, actually. Questions about innovation and openness to science, also huge questions throughout imperial China. So I think he represents a set of particular strands. Right? Did it have to be Xi Jinping? And here we come back to that leadership question again. And I'm so glad that you are of like mind, because I think leaders matter enormously. And I could have easily imagined a different constellation of leaders within the Standing Committee of the Politburo. I think if it had been Li Keqiang instead of Xi Jinping, you would have a radically different China today. So I think it didn't have to be Xi Jinping. It did because it was, but had it not been, I think it would have been quite different. And I'm just going to make one last point on the blinders question, and this is a big issue. Foreign Affairs, the journal where I work, the Council on Foreign Relations, Foreign Affairs is our journal. Some of you may know it, and they published an article by two former Obama administration officials who are good friends of ours, Eli Ratner and Kurt Campbell, that talked about how we got China policy wrong, right, all wrong for the past decades. Now, I think that argument is wrong. Basically, we didn't get China policy wrong. We didn't do everything wrong. We did have influence, through civil society and interaction. But more importantly, Chinese history is not over, right? Chinese history is still going to be written, and we don't know what's going to come in the next 10 to 15 to 20 years. We don't know what that China is going to look like. You see, and this is, Carl's book is a lot about this, all of the different areas of dissent and discontent in society. Party elders unhappy about the, abolition of two-term limit. Entrepreneurs unhappy about being told what to do. Liberal intellectuals, definitely unhappy crowd. Feminists, broad, mass-based movements, feminists, LGBTQ, environmental movement. There's a lot going on there. So I think to say we had blinders on and to say that there's never going to be any kind of political reform, democratization of some sort, I think is a mistake.
Well, I very much agree with what was just said by both. I want to take part of your question seriously, though, did we get anything wrong? And I think many of us, and I wouldn't put this brush across everybody in my field, but I think we were more hopeful about Xi Jinping than he's.
Not me.
No, okay.
Not me.
See, there you
It
go.
is true.
Not
It is
me.
true.
All right,
From the
not
very
Liz.
beginning, not
That is
me.
true.
But a lot of us were, and I just want to lay out the reasons we were optimistic with the idea that it hasn't worked out that way. Well, first of all, I think a way to think about it, who's the exception here, Xi Jinping or Jiang Zemin and Deng Xiaoping? We may come to the conclusion that the more interesting exceptional question is, how did Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin come to their views? I remember meeting Jiang Zemin, and he says, I'm Western educated. Mm-hmm. He was trying to say, I'm one of you. Well, that's not Xi Jinping, and that wouldn't have been most Chinese emperors or Mao. So just who's off center here is an interesting question, and maybe Xi is back to the median, the norm, in terms of political culture. I agree with you. There are new forces in society and technology that are going to make that unsustainable, I believe. So, but in any case, but why did we sort of get Xi wrong, those of us who did get it wrong? First of all, it was dangerous in the previous period because we began to know lots of Chinese. And it just so happened I'd met Xi Jinping's father twice. And he was the architect, along with Deng, of special economic zones, took great political risks. And then Xi Jinping comes in and he goes down to Guangzhou or Guangdong, Shenzhen, and bows at the statue of Deng Xiaoping and by implication his father, and I'm going to be a filial son, which meant to us reform. Now, that goes to show you can look for evidence, and you got 3 data points, and that's what you got. But there was secondly, we all looked at the Cultural Revolution, and in a way, his family, Xi Jinping, and then Xi Jinping, not such a victim, but it wasn't a great time. He had been sent to the countryside. We sort of projected and said, well, this guy's been a victim of the kind of radical politics. Of course, he's not going to get into power and replicate what his father and his family suffered. Realizing China's a black box, it's not like we have that much information on the formative experiences of these individuals and so forth. So I think we made the mistake of just sort of assuming the apple never drops off the tree far from the tree, right? Well, actually,
It does.
they do. But I think it was a reasonable guess. And of course, if you put in the momentum of social change and the market power of the market and all these things and globalization and norms, I think our expectation was certainly hopeful. It's explainable, but we're confronted with a reality that at least we weren't looking for.
So I'm just going to say it's interesting because you're right. We only look at certain data points, but data points that I would look at, and Nick Kristof made that same argument in a New York Times editorial. I don't know whether you remember, saying basically that because his father was such a reformer that Xi Jinping was going to be one too. And I remember reading that article and thinking, is this the level of analysis that we've come to? That because the father was a good guy, we think the son will be too. But to me, I looked at the fact that, this is somebody who applied to be a member of the party some 10 times, right? And if you look back at when he was, provincial party secretary or governor of different provinces, you never heard anything about him as somebody who initiated any reform. You could look at people like Li Yuanchao and see that he did that in Jiangsu province, or remember back to Zhao Ziyang, right? Or you could look at the fact that Li Keqiang was known for having politically reform-oriented ideas when he was, back at the university. Doesn't mean he's going to do it when he's in power, but at least you saw some evidence from when they were younger of different things that they had been doing, or Wang Yang, another good example, right? The way that Wang Yang managed the, what was that, Wukan uprising, right? But with Xi Jinping, you didn't see anything like that. You didn't see any evidence of that kind of. And then I'd say in New York in particular, there was all this excitement around the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress, right? Which was when they announced the economic reform
60
plan,
points.
right? Yeah. And all these bankers, and the Chinese brought all these bankers and other people big name media people to China. Maybe you were one of them, Mike, I don't know. But they brought them to China and kind of sold them on this thing. And they all came back to the council. They're like, blah, blah, this is going to be the huge reform, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, did you actually read this thing? Because while, yes, it says that the market is going to play a decisive role, it also says that the state is going to maintain a commanding role, right? So, read the whole thing. Don't just look for what you think you want.
I was not on
this.
that trip.
You weren't on that trip, okay. Neither was I, as you can tell, so anyway, okay.
I think we're going to get some questions from the audience here, so that'll be good fodder for our ongoing discussion. I also wanted to know, so knowing that we may have missed a couple of things or had some rose-colored glasses on as analysts, what do you see today as being the 2 or 3 things that each of you from your perspective would say, we're just missing this today? Because what you're saying, what you guys are hearing today in the audience has in many ways become not an outlier. I think to Liz's credit, when she was initially very skeptical about the potential for Xi Jinping, it was relatively, within the American China watching community, it was an outlier position at that time. But what you're hearing today, I think, is reflective of what's becoming the new normal, the new sort of way of seeing China. This is the new reality. And so in some ways, it's not all that off base, I think, in the world that we're living in today to hear these views that you're hearing. But what I'm curious about is in this world that we find ourselves today, where this perspective on China and U.S.-China has become the new median voter, to use a political science term, the middle ground, as it were. What are we missing today? What are the 2 or 3 things that you think, as a nation, as analysts, as scholars, when we think about China today, what mistakes would you say we're making as that sort of conventional wisdom today?
I can give 2 things. They're maybe a little bit broader, but it fits in with what you're talking about. It's the idea that there are trends or there are possibilities that don't fit into the structure or the memes that we use to think about China today. The first one I would say is that, and this is more broadly just scholars, I would say this probably applies often to the way the media or popular culture thinks about China. The first is, I think, that when we tend to think about these political developments, which many of us have been talking about, we often think of China as we're very much top-down. We're thinking of what's going on at the elite level. We're thinking about what's taking place, the machinations that are taking place at the Central Leadership Compound in Zhongnanhai. And it's still very much a great man of what's Xi Jinping doing with respect to this. And China, just like elsewhere, it's 1.4 billion people. There are lots of stuff that's happening in society as a whole. I think that's often overlooked. And specifically, one of the things that I think is overlooked is the extent to which, if you think back over history, there is a strong strand of sort of populist pushback, populist uprisings, whether it's Cultural Revolution, whether it is May 4th movement, whether it is Chinese people are not passive. There's a structure that's on top of them, but there is beneath that structure there is a lot of stuff going on. There's passions, there's discontent, there's desires, and those things often you just don't sense them, but they're there, like any other society. It just happens that there's a structure on top of the system. But that's only true up to a point, because then that stuff comes out. I think that's one thing that people often overlook. The second thing is, to the extent that people do think about that, we intuitively look at that stuff as it's all liberal Democrats. Everyone in there is clearly the Washingtons and the feminists who just want to have, and that's also not true. That boiling society looks a lot like ours. You've got really different groups. You've got people who want to take China back to the 1950s because we want class revolution, and I want to overthrow those capitalists in China. You've got people who it's all about the Japanese must pay. You've got people who are motivated by religious belief structures that would seem very unusual. And I think with our American blinders, we often think that if there's pushback in society, if there's disconnect, it's always somehow liberal Democrats. And there's an element, but that's not always the case. That's not the only group of people that's out there.
So I guess maybe I'll make two quick ones. One, since I started off my life as a Soviet person, Soviet scholar, and as Gorbachev analyst in the U.S. government for a couple of years, I am always cognizant of the fact that things can change on the dime, and you never know, right? And who would have expected that an agricultural secretary from the middle of the Soviet Union would turn into somebody who basically unleashed the most significant change in Soviet history. So you never know, right, with Xi Jinping even still. Like, I'm not optimistic, but could I wake up in 5 years and Xi Jinping will have ushered in some other kind of transformation? I think it's not impossible, right? Is it impossible that the other members of the Chinese leadership and people in the CPPCC and others will somehow manage to push Xi Jinping out? Seems just incredible and not possible, but you never know. The system is opaque, and we don't know what's going on in the middle of Zhongnanhai. And so I would just put out there that we don't know, and there's enough that we don't know that we can't really claim much when people always want predictions with any real degree of certainty. I'd say the other thing that we're probably maybe getting wrong is in the way that we're approaching what is, I think, a significant challenge from China. But I think painting China as the enemy akin to the Soviet Union is a mistake, not simply because it is fundamentally different and our relationship is different and globalization makes everything different. There are just so many ways in which it's not the same, but because I think we're now in this very defensive position when it comes to China. We're defensive on the challenge that it poses that they pose on the technology front. We're defensive on what they're doing in the region. We're defensive because we ourselves are not in a space where we can, with confidence, I think, promote our own values and our own strengths. And I think that's something that's, and we're getting it wrong. I don't know whether we can get it right with the current government in the United States, but I think it's something that needs to change, is our own narrative about the United States, our place in the world, and our way of managing the relationship with China. I think what we have is just a negative defensive crouch and like lashing out, as opposed to a positive affirmative approach to the U.S. role in the world.
I'll pick up on the last point and then make one, and I want to hear the audience questions. First of all, just because we don't like something, whether it be the drift of China's foreign and domestic policy, I think we run the risk of not seeing the competitive challenge that it represents, whether we like it or we don't. And I guess I'm more worried that we organize ourselves to be a competitive economic force in the world. A defense, I think you used the word defensive crouch. That's not the way to preserving our position in the world or our welfare. And so I think in a way, a stark recognition of the successes China's having along with the failures, or at least, let's say, arguable pushing forward, and its dramatic increases in comprehensive national power, however you want to measure it. Those are important realities that are, what we think of as of marginal interest. So I would say take the challenge seriously, try to define it, and build our national capabilities and policies to enhance those. I think that's one thing. Secondly, and this is a good place to sort of end our monologue here, or dialogue, and is at the Bush School, and say, what was the insight that Richard Nixon and certainly George Herbert Walker Bush and Brent Scowcroft had? It's not in the interests of the United States to push China and Russia together. I think that's an insight to remember, and that's exactly what we're doing. Now, it's easy to describe the problem, not so easy to, particularly when they're cooperating in massive military exercises, but we should not be comfortable that the land mass of Eurasia, at least those two big components of it, are working against us. And so I would say, remember the wisdom of the people that are associated with this institution.
That's great. I think that's a nice way to transition into the wisdom of this institution. So the current embodiment of that living legacy. One of the things that's, I think, a brilliant move on the part of President Bush 41 was that he said what he wanted to found was this school. This is the living legacy of 41. He wants to have it be a place that will train future leaders that will go and serve the United States in that capacity. And I think that was just, again, another brilliant strategic move. You could have the library or whatever, but I want a school that's going to produce people that'll have a commitment to public service. And I think that's one of the things that makes me very proud to be a professor here. It's one of the things I really value. Every day going into the classroom and having these kids as my students who are then later going to make this world a better place. That's pretty neat. That's pretty cool. So using that as a jumping off point for some of the questions we got from the audience. Given the legitimate or instrumental use of the anti-corruption campaign, could Xi Jinping's rescinding of the succession norm be a move that he did to protect himself from other potential powerful political actors, to insulate himself? Or is this possibly motivated by inability of Xi Jinping to find a suitable successor in time for the 19th Party Congress who's going to be able to protect him? And so he wants just the option to keep that possibility open.
Well, I'll take a stab
Sure,
on
yeah,
that one.
Yeah, go for it.
I think being a lame duck in China is a real dangerous thing. And so he, by engineering this, he's not a lame duck, which means everybody has to take account. He may be around for a long time, so don't cross him. The minute you put a circle around a date and say, this is the date I'm gone, you can end up like Hu Jintao ended up, pretty much. So I think you can, and also I remember back when I was a graduate student, Tong Zhou wrote a lot of articles, but including one that said, don't forget, politics in China is zero sum. It's about winners and losers, and compromise isn't the essential idea as it used to be here, for example. So I think, and I didn't say, but I've been of the opinion that even you may remember in 2012 when he came in, he disappeared for 11 days. It's an interesting question where he was. All I can report is there are a lot of people from China that have conveyed to me that maybe he was threatened in a very physical way. I'll leave it at that, but you get my drift. And he replaced the palace guard, and then very shortly thereafter took extraordinary personal security measures. So I think Xi Jinping has not forgotten what the essential element of Chinese politics is, the role of force. And I think, of course, by breaking the norm of succession, of course, he made a lot of enemies too. But on the other hand, he put himself in a position to protect himself. And politics isn't just about Xi Jinping, it's his family and all his ancestors, basically. So there's a lot at stake in the pretty cutthroat Chinese system.
Another stream of questioning that came from the audience was around the rise of the Chinese middle class and what that means for the future. And dovetailed into that was sentiment around reform and where the Chinese reform endeavor is going to go. And where does that leave us then with China? So if you take Carl's sketches out to their logical conclusion, it's a pretty bleak outcome, I think, in a lot of ways. But the audience was asking questions related to you hear this argument about a dynamic middle class and how when you get to a certain level of development, things are going to change. And you also have questions around the reform itself. And has China's economy, have we already seen peak China? Are we now seeing the final end of the Chinese economic miracle? And what does that future look like? Do anyone want to respond to some of those questions from the audience?
I can try to take a crack at one of those. So on the question about sort of the economic development, the argument that's often advanced, that I think some of the questions we're referring to, is the idea that when a country hits a certain level of economic development, sort of political liberalization just sort of naturally takes place. And people often look at countries such as Taiwan or South Korea when they're thinking about that. And I think if you actually start carefully looking, for example, at the example of Taiwan, what you see is that people often think it's the end of martial law and sort of the dramatic political changes that happened in Taiwan in the late 80s or early 90s that are the relevant ones. But it actually goes back much earlier than that. The Taiwan example where Taiwan hits its level where change starts happening is actually in the 70s. And that's the point in Taiwan where you start to get this sort of gradual opening at the very grassroots level for the possibilities of local elections. And that's where the discontent in society starts getting channeled into certain DPP, the opposition forces, begin to sort of take position in the local elections. And eventually that migrates up to them. But it's a 3 or 4 decade long process which takes place. So if you want to think about that analogy for China, I think that does lead you back to sort of some of these experiments in the 80s and the 90s, where Chinese authorities themselves there was some openness. Folks such as Xi Jinping, noted dissident, was holding a position in 2003 in the Haidian People's Congress in Beijing, local level. And you could have imagined an alternative future by which that group, the discontent, started to flow into the institutions, and over a long period of time, that eventually led to change. Unfortunately, those doors progressively got closed, and that's, I think, part how the situation we end up with here right now. The consequence, or when people point to like the urban middle class that can buy Starbucks and lives in nice apartments, I think one of the things people often overlook is the fact that in China today, their interests are deeply tied into the existing party structure, which is to say, if you're a middle-class person living in Shanghai, what you're really worried about is that the migrant workers who are in your city, or the rural poor, that their children are getting into the same schools that your kids are going to. And you're kind of a beneficiary of the residential permit, the hukou exclusionary stuff that keeps you enjoying certain benefits. So in fact, the middle class in China is a very conflicted area. Do you really want to see the system change dramatically? If so, what does that mean for whether or not your goodies, your private property, your wealth gets reallocated somehow? And that's, I think, some ways where the middle class today it's not necessarily a force for deep political change, because they realize you open up that door, a lot of cards get reshuffled, and you don't know how that could end.
Another question comes about the re-education camps in Xinjiang. Your reaction to those, what do you think is the right approach that we ought to take as the United States? When you see something like this happening in today's China, what is the right option?
Well, I guess, it's appalling. And I have to say, that is something that has surprised me. The degree to which Xinjiang has become, nothing less than a police state at this point, where, as much as 10% of the adult Uyghur population is in these re-education camps, right? And people just plucked from their homes, and, just the extraordinary level of repression, of political repression, and of efforts to erode, cultural, linguistic, and religious, any kind of autonomy for the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So what is the appropriate response of the United States? It's interesting. I'm glad to see that the United Nations has come out quite strongly. I think that's a function of Michelle Bachelet, from the former president of Chile, who's playing a pretty significant role in condemning what China is going on. I think shining an international spotlight. China doesn't, look, I think we're in a weak position, given what we've just been doing, with separating migrant families and things like this. I think our call on human rights is as weak as it's ever been in the recent past, but we still need to call it out. And it's actually something, I did some congressional briefings about a month ago or so, and I made this point: why is nobody here talking about this issue to about 90 congressional staffers? So I'm pleased that now they're starting to talk about it in Washington. fine, the Magnitsky Act and potentially sanctioning some of the officials that are directly responsible for that. I think that's fine too. But what China really doesn't like is when the whole world comes together and focuses on the same issue. You know, to some extent, they can turn a deaf ear to the United States. Again, we have our own pretty bad practices right now, and they can kind of shut us up. But if a lot of other countries, the Europeans, United States, and even if some developing countries began to come and put some pressure on China, maybe you'd start to get a little bit of a relaxation. I'm not optimistic, but I think at this point, I can't think of anything more that we should be doing. But I'm glad to see that we are at least bringing the issue to the forefront.
I'll add one other thing just on top of Liz's point, and I think that it's often easy when you focus China. There's lots of human rights issues associated with what's going on. I think it's easy for some things to get kind of overlooked. This is a different magnitude. This is something quite different. There was an era in China which pre-1978, in which large swaths of the population were categorized, former landlord elements, bad class background. And you sort of unilaterally sort of adopted sanctions, indiscriminately against that group. That faded after post-1978. This is political re-education camps for, as Liz mentioned, a wide swath of just Uyghur population. Just you're Uyghur, you're male, many male, women too. But
some women too.
But this is just very broad, and it's a human rights issue in and of itself. The other thing to think is, this is beginning to reopen something. Some of those practices are starting to spread not directly, not just against Uyghurs, but some of that stuff is in Gansu and Ningxia, where the population isn't just Uyghur, it's Hui Muslim. You start seeing those boundaries crossed, you have to start asking questions, what about the Christian population, which is also a source of concern for central authorities. This is how some of those those social splits, which we thought were closed, could start to reopen again as the security impulse starts to, and that really worries me, because I can start to see how it's like a crack that just starts to spread, and I'm really worried about this.
Okay, you guys will like this next one. So in light of those comments, would this excellent session have been even better if we had an articulate Chinese representative on the panel who had a chance to speak? And I'm gonna add my own editorializing to this question. You all engage in these discussions on a regular basis with the policy community. One of the things that's great about this world is not only do I get to be a political scientist, which I was trained as, but I get to have relevance to the real world. And so I actually get to engage in the real world, which frankly, a lot of political science is beginning to kind of drift away from the real world applications of what they do. In that spirit, since you all are deeply engaged in the policy environment, could you try to articulate the Chinese response to the criticisms that you've just laid out on the Xinjiang situation? And then try to do it as objectively as possible to give the audience a fair taste of what the Chinese side of this equation looks like and what their side looks like. And then feel free to rebut yourselves.
I'll just say, one question is when you say a Chinese voice, what do you mean by, there are lots of different Chinese people.
Exactly.
I mean, are you talking about a party voice? Are you talking about, with the voice you'd get out of a party apparatus in Beijing?
We're looking for an articulate Chinese representative.
Chinese ethnic
Yeah,
Chinese?
I think you have to say, we're not talking about Min Xin or Min Xin Pei and Huang Yasheng, and there are plenty of Chinese scholars who would say basically exactly what we're saying right now. But we're talking about, he's talking about a party, whoever asked the question is talking about a party official. So go ahead.
I would say, I probably can deliver, but again, this is the official stance.
Right,
You're not
that's what it is.
Right, if you're just getting the official, look, national security predominates over everything. We literally had, the stabbing incident in the 100 people, 100 people killed in the Kunming train station in 2000. Guantanamo, you've detained large numbers of people. We're doing the same thing. These are just vocational camps. We're providing. There's a range of rationales that you can give about this. And at the end of the day, it's security predominates over everything, and we need to do this. That I think probably would be sort of the heart of the response that you'd be getting.
Just add one thing, this Chinese representative, if you mean somebody from the PRC that has to go back to the PRC, and it's not just a Chinese ethnic person, but a citizen that has to go back, first of all, they're not going to be on this stage. They're not going to put themselves in the position to be on this stage. Secondly, they'd have visa problems getting out of China. to attend. So maybe you have to explain what you're doing. And visa exits have become more difficult. So if you actually mean a representative of the Chinese government in any way, shape, or form, or even a professor at a college, I don't think they're going to be here under these circumstances. You buy that?
They might be here. They might not choose to answer that particular question.
It may not be convenient.
Yeah, exactly.
I tend to try to be punctual because my mom never was, and so this is like my way of rebelling against that. But I want to leave us with one more interesting question, I think, particularly for this audience. As you know, we're a policy school, and I always try to make things germane to the students. What advice would you give a young person who's about to start their career and they want to focus on China? Now, sitting where you all are sitting now today looking at it, what should they be thinking about? Where should they be focusing their efforts? What aspect of China would you say is that element that we really need to know a lot more about? Where should we build that next generation of capacity around what element of China studies?
Start studying Chinese now while you're young. It will pay off enormously in the future. And seriously, I mean, the way you understand the country is by talking to Chinese people. That's how you understand it. And but you can't do it without having the language. So if you're interested, start now and go live in Taiwan or mainland China for a period of time.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think you should follow whatever it is that you're interested in. You never know what is going to emerge as the most important issue of the day. I can say I worked on, my dissertation work was on the environment. I was actually looking at Chinese and Soviet, then Russian strategies toward climate change. This was in the early 1990s. Not a big deal. But you know, I started working at the Council on Foreign Relations, and within like 4 years, I was briefing Vice President Gore. Who knew that this was going to become a huge issue for the U.S. government or in the U.S.-China relationship? Certainly I didn't know that. It was just something that I was really interested in. So I'm of a mind that you follow your passion because that's what you're going to be best at, and then the rest will take care of itself.
I did not pay her to say that.
Do you say that too?
I say the same thing.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Follow your passions. The rest will work.
Well, I very much agree with the follow your, whatever you're interested in. I've always thought if I didn't do China, I would have done Indonesia, biggest Islamic country in the world, right? Fascinating culture. So anything can get your imagination and follow that. If I were looking at it as I did when I came into the field, I said, I had a very simple kind of, China's 25% of the world's people, and we've staked out the position we're not going to talk to them, and we're not going to do anything with them. And I said, that can't be sustainable. Now, that was a pretty good instinct, in the last 40 years, right? And I think that the case for that's better now than it was when I made the choice. So I wouldn't certainly discourage anybody. It's precisely the problems that should interest you. And I think, I listed 8 problems that you can find in the morning paper. So I think if you're drawn to big problems that are going to shape the world, China's, there's a better case for it now than in 1968 when I was thinking about it.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a great discussion.